What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 17. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 17. Happy New Year's to everyone. It's going to be a somewhat quick version of my final look, as I'm going to go through the players I like for each position. Then I'll highlight one or two of my favorite picks. So at the quarterback position, I like Justin Fields from the Chicago Bears playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They're giving up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Justin Fields has averaged 21.2 fantasy points per game on the season. And I like this pick because he's getting an average of 10.7 rush attempts per game. Gonna be about 8% owned, projected at 21.4 fantasy points here in Week 17. He's $7,900 DraftKings salary, $500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's gonna be 52.5 points scored in this game, with the Bears trailing by 6. So Justin Fields has scored 10, 24, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 7, 15, and 6 rush attempts in those games. Fantastic matchup, high scoring game, and a good game script. So I like Justin Fields here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, I also like Justin Herbert. I think Tom Brady is a good sleeper pick here versus the Carolina Panthers. Pretty good matchup at only 4% ownership. I also like Aaron Rodgers from the Green Bay Packers playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the second worst defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Aaron Rodgers has averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 17.3 fantasy points here this week. And he's only $6,000 DraftKings salary. He's $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Packers favored by 3.5. So Aaron Rodgers has scored 14, 12, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 7, 3, and 3 rush attempts in those games. So fantastic matchup, somewhat high scoring game here. And I do think Rodgers can score 20 fantasy points or more in this one, fighting for his playoff life. So I like Aaron Rodgers here versus the Minnesota Vikings. I also like Daniel Jones and Jared Goff from the Detroit Lions playing the Chicago Bears, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. Give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jared Goff has averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 1.7 rush attempts per game. Gonna be about 13% owned. He's projected at 18.6 fantasy points here this week. Only $5,600 DraftKings salary, $1,800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions favored by 6. Jared Goff has scored 30, 14, and 29 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 3 and 0 and 2 rush attempts in those games. So good matchup in this high-scoring game. So I like Jared Goff here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the stud on the slate, Christian McCaffrey, he's going to be about 23% owned. Has a good matchup here versus the Raiders, who have the 7th worst defense overall, give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So Christian McCaffrey, high ownership, he's 9,000 DraftKings salary, projected at 20 fantasy points here this week. He's 500 more on FanDuel, so he's a stud on the slate you could go to in a good matchup. So I like Christian McCaffrey. Also like Austin Eckler and James Conner, but the stud that I like the most on the slate is Saquon Barkley from the New York Giants, playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Saquon Barkley has averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18.9 rush attempts per game, 4.8 pass targets per game, been on the field for 80% of the snaps. I think that leads all running backs on the slate. Let me check it. For the guys that have been playing all season, yes, he leads the snap count for all running backs, for running backs that have played all season long. Okay, so Saquon Barkley, he is going to be about 16% owned, projected at 17.3 fantasy points here in week 17. He's 8,000 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 39 points scored in this game, with the Giants favored by 5.5. So Saquon Barkley has scored 27, 23, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 14, 18, and 9 rush attempts, on top of 10, 8, and 2 pass targets. So 18 pass targets the past 2 weeks, over 20 touches the past 2 weeks. I think that continues here in a favorable matchup. Could be a running game script as well. The Colts didn't look very good last week. So I like Saquon Barkley here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Now I also like Travis Etienne from the Jacksonville Jaguars, playing the Houston Texans, who give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Travis Etienne is 6,400 DraftKings salary. He scored 14 and 17 fantasy points in his last 2 games off of 22 and 19 rush attempts, on top of 3 and 3 pass targets. So good volume, over 20 touches the past 2 games. Going to be about 17% owned, projected at 15 fantasy points here this week. 6,400 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. So I like Travis Etienne here versus the Houston Texans. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. And the winner is Tom Hogg. Congratulations, Tom Hogg. You are the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position.
So a stud on the slate that I like is Amon-Ra St. Brown from the Detroit Lions, playing the Chicago Bears, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown has averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.4 pass targets per game. Almost averages 1 rush attempt per game as well. Been on the field for 77% of the snaps. Going to be about 23% owned. Projected at 19.8 fantasy points here this week. He's 7,800 DraftKings salary, 400 more on FanDuel. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions favored by 6. Amon-Ra St. Brown has scored 15, 15, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 13, 10, and 9 pass targets on top of 1 rush attempt in each of those games. So I like Amon-Ra St. Brown here versus the Chicago Bears. I also like Keenan Allen from the LA Chargers playing the LA Rams, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Keenan Allen has averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9 pass targets per game, on the field for 72% of the snaps, going to be about 16% owned, projected at 16.2 fantasy points here this week. He's 7,000 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel, and Keenan Allen has scored 24, 17, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 14, 9, and 14 pass targets. So I like Keenan Allen here versus the LA Rams. Now you could also consider Chris Godwin in a good matchup here versus the Carolina Panthers. He's averaging 9.7 pass targets per game and 15 fantasy points per game. He got 10, 8, and 9 pass targets the last 3 weeks. He's been on the field for 84% of the snaps. Going to be about 7% owned. He's 6,800 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Bucs favored by 3.5. Chris Godwin has scored 14, 22, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 10, 8, and 9 pass targets. So lots of volume for Chris Godwin. He seems to be Tom Brady's favorite wide receiver in a good matchup in a game they need to win. So I like Chris Godwin here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, moving down in salary, I like Garrett Wilson from the New York Jets with Mike White back in action. And then I like Allen Lazard from the Green Bay Packers with a great matchup here versus the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Allen Lazard has averaged 11.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 91% of the snaps, going to be about 16% owned, projected at 12.9 fantasy points here this week. He's 5,400 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Packers favored by 3.5. Now, Allen Lazard, he's been kind of hit or miss this season, but I do think he's in a good spot here this week at a low price point. So I like Allen Lazard here versus the Minnesota Vikings. And one of my favorite mid-range plays here is Jacoby Myers from the New England Patriots playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the 4th worst defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Jacoby Myers has averaged 13 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 78% of the snaps. Going to be about 14% owned. Projected at 11.8 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,000 DraftKings salary, $1,700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Patriots favored by 2.5. Jacoby Myers has scored 20 and 6 fantasy points in his 2 games back, off of 7 and 6 pass targets. So this will be his 3rd game back. Decent matchup, game they need to win. So I like Jacoby Myers here versus the Miami Dolphins. Now moving down in salary here, I like Brandon Cooks from the Houston Texans. He came back last week and scored 13 fantasy points off of 9 pass targets. They're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 9th worst defense overall, give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Brandon Cooks going to be about 9% owned, on the field for 80% of the snaps, projected at 11.7 fantasy points here this week. He's $4,800 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Texans trailing by 3. So I like Brandon Cooks here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now a sleeper pick I like, Jahan Dotson from the Washington Commanders, playing the Cleveland Browns. He scored 20, 24, and 16 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 9, 6, and 9 pass targets. Been on the field for 78% of the snaps. Only going to be about 3% owned. Only $4,600 DraftKings salary, $1,500 more on FanDuel. So I like Jahan Dotson as a sleeper pick here versus the Cleveland Browns.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So, of course, I like Travis Kelce, but he's expensive at $8,100 DraftKings salary, $200 more on FanDuel. He's got a good matchup versus the Denver Broncos. But if you want to save some salary here, take a look at George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 7th worst defense overall, give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. He's averaging 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.5 pass targets per game. On the field for 89% of the snaps, going to be about 10% owned, projected at 12.1 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,900 DraftKings salary, $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 9.5. And George Kittle has scored 33, 25, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 8, 5, and 5 pass targets. So it looks like he is one of Brock Purdy's favorite targets here. Likes to go to George Kittle, so it's a good matchup. So I like George Kittle here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. I also like TJ Hawkinson from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. And I've said this the past couple of games that even though the Minnesota Vikings have their playoff seed locked up, Remember, TJ Hawkinson joined them midway through the season, so he is going to be out there running routes, continuing to learn the offense. And TJ Hawkinson has averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.7 pass targets per game. On the field for 87% of the snaps, going to be about 9% owned, projected at 14 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,400 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Vikings trailing by 3.5. TJ Hawkinson has scored 39, 8, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 16, 9, and 8 pass targets. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the Green Bay Packers. Now I also like Evan Ingram from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram has averaged 11.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. On the field for 77% of the snaps, going to be about 12% owned, projected at 12.2 fantasy points here in week 17. He's $4,400 DraftKings salary, $1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Jaguars favored by 3. Evan Ingram scored 21, 14, and 42 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 10, and 15 pass targets. So I like Evan Ingram here versus the Houston Texans.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.